God knows who will be in Christ. The choice he makes, it is a choice of us, as Paul says. I think there is, even in the language, arguably a corporate context to it. God chose a people before the foundation of the world.
In other words, God, the triune God, in eternity past, chose to save a particular people, Titus chapter 2, only in Christ Jesus, and not in any other way.
And this people, as we know from Ephesians 1 verse 1, are the faithful in Christ Jesus that are being referred to. And so I think it's a perfectly reasonable, contextually consistent biblical response that even has good grounding in, I think, the election of Israel and how we see that play out, how that works, what that looks like throughout the Old Testament, to say that when Paul says God chose us in him before the foundation of the world, I think you could accurately say God chose, well, who's the us? We all agree the us he's talking to is the faithful in Christ Jesus. So God chose the faithful in Christ Jesus before the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless. So does that mean God chose Bob and Tom and Susan to be faithful in Christ Jesus? Does that mean he said before the foundation of the world, I'm going to make Bob somebody who loves me? I'm going to leave these other people, the Phil and the George, I'm not going to make them the faithful in Christ Jesus. Tom, Bob, Susan, they're going to, by my decretive will, or I'm going to make them the faithful in Christ Jesus. So basically, God chose specific people to be in Christ.
What Paul instead says is that not that God chose individuals to eventually get into Christ or chose them to be in Christ at some future point in time, but the choice of individuals by God was absolutely conditioned on this phrase, in Christ.
So the benefits of his sacrificial death only are given to those who are in Christ, in him. The realm of that choice is in Christ. That choice is only in Christ. Our union with Christ is central to our understanding of who we are and how we are saved.
God chose people in him, not to eventually get in him.
We have every blessing in the heavenly places because we are in Christ Jesus. Oh my goodness, is Jesus important. Nothing comes to us except by our connection with Jesus.
So they will have already established that this connection, it's only within this connection that we can be chosen. And then in different places, what you'll hear is places like where Piper will say that he'll say on the one hand, yes, our chosenness, this blessing, this privilege, it's only within our connection to Christ that we can have it. And then in another place he'll say, but that choice of God was actually a choice of us to be in that sphere. So it's a choice that's not within the context of the sphere, it's a choice, some kind of separate blessing that places us in the sphere in the first place.
And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus. So we are chosen to be in Christ, chosen individually to be in Christ, chosen individually to be in Christ.
So I see no other way to see that than to see it as a choice of us, of God choosing us, not in Christ, but out of Christ. That really this is God choosing us out of Christ.
He chose us in him before the foundation of the world. That means that before God had created anything, in the mind of God, he had already identified those who he would place in union with his Son.
So there you have him communicating that getting Jesus is actually a fruit of election. That what happens first is that God chooses individuals, and that choice of them, that mysterious blessing and favor we get from the Father, eventually brings us into connection and union with the Son. And so that is Jesus being a fruit of election rather than election, the spiritual blessing of election being a fruit of Jesus.
If you have faith today in Christ and are thus united to Christ, it is because God chose you for this before the foundation of the world.
That gives this idea of individuals somehow getting this special relationship with the Father prior to union with Christ and ultimately outside of Christ.
I think a much better way and simpler way even of interpreting this that leads to far less theological baggage is to simply look at the us who Paul is addressing, the faithful in Christ Jesus, and to see that God chose a people.
So we are launching now into this massive issue of God's choosing a people for himself.
In other words, God, the triune God, in eternity past, chose to save a particular people, Titus chapter 2.
Now, one of the offensive things that I think is communicated in the New Testament is that being a natural descendant of Israel or Abraham didn't necessarily guarantee that you were a true member of that covenant people. I think that's one of the things that Paul tries to get across in places like Galatians 3:7 when he says, "Know then, it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham." And then in Romans 2:28 through 29, where he says, "For no one is a Jew, no one is a true Jew, no one is part of this chosen people, truly, who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly." So if you want to be a true member of this corporate Israel, Paul says, it doesn't just come by being a natural-born descendant of Abraham. So even though the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, was God's chosen people, that didn't necessarily guarantee that every individual within that nation was a part of the true covenant people of God, true sons of Abraham, a true Jew. Just as God chose a people, Israel, and whether you were a true member of that elect corporate group depended on faithfulness, depended on faith, your response to God. I think in the same way, God has chosen a people to be holy and blameless, a specific people, that is the church. God chose the faithful in Christ Jesus as the people who would get the spiritual blessing of being holy and blameless. Now, that says nothing about whether or not God chose who would get into this category of people. So there's so many other things. I know we could go down a rabbit trail there about, well, the direct object of the verb chose is us, which I have no problem with. Yes, it is us. That is the direct object. But it's us. And I think you should at least, I would hope, I think if you're being sensible, if a Calvinist is being sensible, they should at least be able to look at this interpretation that I'm giving and not act like it's some crazy, outlandish, impossible way to interpret this passage, which is often the case. That I think it's sort of a attempt to distract. This is legitimate, and I think it objectively so, a legitimate way to look at this text. God chose the faithful in Christ Jesus. I just think there's nothing about this passage that should lead the Calvinist to hear that interpretation and act like it's some strange, bizarre, outlandish, and impossible way of reading this text.